Thanks for joining me today for Just a Thought. We're continuing in Romans chapter 12 and verse 16. The next phrase that we come across is, do not set your mind on high things. Now, all these statements are a little bit different than the other. But again, as I mentioned yesterday, these all combine with one another. Be of the same mind toward one another. Do not set your mind on high things, but associate with the humble. Do not be wise in your own opinion. And so we will address these as we go through this week. But I want you to notice, do not set your mind on high things. Now, that doesn't imply that we don't set our mind on things above. In fact, let's go ahead and take a look at Colossians chapter 3. And here in Colossians chapter 3, there's no contradiction. We want to understand that we are to set our mind on things above, but that's not what he's implying here. It's not what Paul is saying in Romans 12 verse 16, to not set your mind on high things. It's the idea of prestige, or setting your mind on things that would elevate you and bring attention to yourself, and that kind of thought. In Colossians chapter 3, and beginning in verse 1, if then you were raised with Christ, seek those things which are above. You can't get any higher than this above that he's going to be referring to, where Christ is sitting at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above. Now, he just got through saying seek. Now he's saying set your mind on things above, not on things on the earth. You see, the difference is the spiritual application. For you died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. So we set our minds on spiritual matters, not physical things. Now, how many people are seeking to draw attention to themselves? They're looking for that 15 minutes of fame. They're constantly saying, look at me. And we have people on Facebook who are telling us what they're going to be cooking for dinner. And it just seems to be drawing attention to themselves. And in that sense, it's a look at me society. Do not set your mind on high things. Turn with me over to Psalm 131. Psalm 131 and verse 1. Lord, my heart is not haughty. Now, haughtiness is the opposite of lowliness. You see, we typically are a people who want to put ourselves up on a pedestal. We want to be thought in good light, and there's some legitimacy in regard to that, and righteousness and so on. But I'm talking about as far as our career is concerned. Our house, the car we drive, the clothes we wear, the people we hang out with, the places we go on vacation. And what we're doing is we're elevating ourselves in the process. Lord, my heart is not haughty or proud, nor my eyes lofty or arrogant. Neither do I concern myself with great matters, nor with things too profound for me. That is quite interesting. But let's focus our attention on this idea of haughty and lofty. We cannot be a people who think of ourselves as being high and mighty. No matter our position, even if we're the owner of the company, we need to understand that we are servants to others. And we are not above others. That's exactly what Paul is rendering here. Do not set your mind on high things. Again, the connection. Be of the same mind toward one another. We have a tendency, maybe it's within our nature, to think that what we think is the best. And that's exactly how we're going to end this week. Do not be wise in your own opinion. Well, turn with me over to Romans chapter 12 and verse 3. So this is where we've been spending all of our time, in Romans chapter 12. But let's back up to verse 3. We started in verse 9 in regard to this study. But in Romans chapter 12 and verse 3, "For I say, through the grace given to me, to everyone who is among you, do not think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith." I knew a man, he's close to my age, and when you talk to him, we would consider him down to earth. Have you ever heard that term? Well, they're really down to earth. Well, we typically will say that when that individual is someone who's in authority, or someone who is famous, someone whose name is recognized, someone who is applauded, someone who is in a position in which they receive acclamations. And it's almost kind of contradictory when we see them, and they're just like everybody else in that sense, that they're not high and mighty, they're not above you, they're not looking down their nose at you. And we say, wow, they're down to earth. They don't have their head in the sky or head in the clouds. So when we read Romans 13 and verse 3, it says, "Do not think of himself more highly than he ought to think." Do we have a tendency, if we just bought a new car, to think we're better than so-and-so? Do we have a haughtiness to us that elevates us above others? And therefore, we're really demeaning towards others. And so that's what God is wanting us to understand. Do not set your mind on high things. It may even go in regard to a career. That we need to be careful not to pursue things that would put us in a position where we look down on others. Jesus' teaching is that if you want to be great in the kingdom, you become a servant. And that's exactly what he did. He didn't come to be served. He came to serve. And that's the opposite of this idea of thinking more highly than we ought to of ourselves. Setting our mind on high things. It is that idea that we are better than others. So we need to be careful about that. Elders shouldn't do it. Preachers shouldn't do it. Deacons shouldn't do it. Those who are old and you've been around for as long as dirt, you're not better than the teenager or the newlyweds or the first-time parents. We have a tendency to have that kind of haughtiness based upon our age or our accomplishments. We need to stick that in our back pocket and forget about it. And be of the same mind toward one another. Have care and concern for one another. And keep our heads down here on earth and not in the clouds.